We did that already. Okay, how much mitigation is enough? If we were to be able to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases and particles in the atmosphere at the equivalent of 550 parts per million of carbon dioxide, that would give you about a 50% chance of staying under a temperature increase of 3 degrees C. A decade ago, people thought that might be good enough. At the pace at which harmful effects are appearing, even at today's much lower level, it's becoming pretty clear that 550 parts per million, 3 degrees C, is unlikely to avoid an unmanageable degree of climate change. And it's being more and more widely concluded that 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, which gives you about a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees C, would be a more prudent level. Not a guarantee, obviously, of no harmful effects. We're already experiencing harmful effects with the carbon dioxide at about 390, and the carbon dioxide equivalent quite similar, because it turns out that the effects of the various non-CO2 influences are roughly canceling out. To achieve that, to stabilize at 450 parts per million of CO2 alone, requires that global emissions in total would level off by about 2020 and decline thereafter to 50% below 2000 emissions by 2050. And under the assumption that the developing countries are going to need at least somewhat longer before they're able to stabilize and start to decline, if you assume that the developing countries are not going to do that until 2025, then the industrialized countries need to be doing it by about 2015, and they need to decline even more steeply to about 80% below year 2000 emissions by 2050, and that is roughly the goal that President Obama has enunciated. Now, just a few realities about the challenge of meeting that target. If one is to stabilize at 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, it means that the CO2 emissions themselves in 2050 must be at least 7 to 9 billion tons of contained carbon per year below business as usual. That's it. That is a cut of 50% or more from what business as usual would be by then. If we stayed on the current trajectory, we would have twice or more as much CO2 as is compatible with a target of having a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees C. To understand what 7 to 9 gigatons of carbon per year contained in CO2 means, here are some examples of what it takes to avoid 1 billion tons. Again, keep in mind, we need to avoid 7 to 9 by 2050. If all the world's buildings were to use 20 to 25% less energy, all the residences, all the commercial buildings in the world were to use 20 to 25% less energy than is forecasted under business as usual, which already includes a lot of efficiency improvement, that would save 1 gigaton of carbon per year. If 2 billion cars got 60 miles a gallon instead of 30 miles a gallon, that would save 1 gigaton per year, 1/7 to 1/9 of what you need. If 800 large coal-burning power plants, 1 electrical gigawatt, million kilowatt electric coal-burning power plants, 800 of them capture and store their CO2 with very high efficiency, that avoids 1 gigaton. If we build 700 new nuclear power plants of a gigawatt each, which all replace coal-burning power plants which would have released their CO2, that's 1 gigaton per year of carbon. 1 million 2-megawatt wind turbines, or 2,000 1 gigawatt photovoltaic power plants replacing coal power plants is 1 gigaton per year. Clearly, you want to get 7 or 9 gigatons. You have to do all of these things and some more. So this is a big challenge in terms of the magnitude of the activity that's required. Here's a somewhat more sophisticated approach to looking at what we need to do, how fast. This is a supply curve for avoided greenhouse gas emissions for the globe, which in total shows across the whole horizontal axis how much we need to reduce CO2 emissions by 2030 to be on this trajectory that stabilizes at 450 parts per million, 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees C. The items below the zero are activities that actually make money under current circumstances. That is, the amount of energy they save, for example, is worth more than the cost of implementing them. So those are things that, in principle, in an economically rational world, we'd be doing already that would have the effect of reducing CO2 emissions but would have other benefits, which is why we'd be doing them even in the absence of any economic incentive currently to reduce these emissions. The items that have bars extending above the line are things you have to pay for. That is, there's a net cost of using these measures. And they're all measured in dollars per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and the most expensive ones are up around $75 or $80 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And you can argue about whether the numbers are all exactly right, but it's a quite useful heuristic for understanding the options. And the way I like to think about what this tells us about policy needs is shown here. I like the fruit tree metaphor. The stuff that already pays is low-hanging fruit or fruit that's lying on the ground. And the only problem, there's a fence around the tree in the form of a variety of barriers to getting at that low-hanging fruit and the fruit on the ground. And those barriers are information barriers, they're financing barriers, they're perverse incentives of a variety of kinds. We can get rid of those through policies. Get rid of the barriers to picking the low-hanging fruit. In the middle range, what one has is a variety of options that would become attractive if we had a modest price on greenhouse gas emissions. And there what we need is to embed such a price in national and global policy. So there is an economic incentive reflecting the social cost of putting this stuff in the atmosphere that produces an incentive to do these somewhat more expensive measures. On the far right are measures that would be too expensive even under the modest charges for greenhouse gas emissions that are likely to be implemented over the next 20 years. And so what you need there is research and development and demonstration to lower that highest hanging fruit into reach. So we have a three-pronged set of needs in energy policy, essentially barrier busting, incentives to reach higher into the tree, and research, development, and demonstration to lower the highest hanging fruit into reach. So what are we doing in this domain? Well, the strategy is, first of all, to try to promote recognition that the problem is real and that acting sooner is preferable to acting later. That's partly because the longer we wait, the bigger the damages will become and the more rapid the reductions that will be needed to stabilize the atmosphere. Prudent action is going to be cheaper than inaction or delay. We can reduce costly and risky oil imports and dangerous air pollution with many of the same measures that we employ to reduce the climate-disrupting emissions. And there's an interesting and I think quite good argument that says that the needed surge of innovation in clean energy technologies and energy efficiency that we're going to need to do this will in fact create new businesses, new jobs, help drive economic recovery and growth, and maintain global competitiveness. Another way of saying that last line is if we don't figure out how to reduce these emissions economically, other people will do so and will be selling the technologies to us. Now, I got out of order here, so we'll just put them all in. Let's see. So what we've been doing to try to get this done, a number of aspects of this, providing new funding and initiatives for energy research, development, demonstration, and deployment for climate change research and adaptation. We've been revitalizing the U.S. Global Change Research Program and other interagency efforts, trying to work with Congress, that's been a challenge, to get comprehensive energy and climate legislation that would put a price on greenhouse gas emissions, and working with other countries to build cooperation in clean energy technology and to develop individual and joint climate policies that are consistent with avoiding the unmanageable. Some of the initiatives, the Recovery Act had $80 billion for clean and efficient energy in it, including efficient transportation. The new ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, got $400 million in the Recovery Act for 2009 and 10. Budget proposal by the President for 2011 is $300 million more. Variety of other increases in the Department of Energy's budget. All applied energy R&D in the President's 2011 request would be $3.9 billion, a 7% increase. Energy Frontier Research Centers would get $140 million. The Energy Innovation Hubs, $107 million. Basic energy science is up 12%. If you look at the history of applied energy technology research, development, and demonstration over the period from 1978 to 2011, you see that we have been gradually coming up again, except for a very rapid boost in the Recovery Act period. And of course, many people are wondering what we do for an encore when the Recovery Act money runs out. Virtually everybody who studies this concludes that we should be spending something in the range of 3 to 4 times as much on energy research, development, and demonstration in the federal government as we are now, as well as providing additional incentive to the private sector to do more in this domain. There are a lot of things that different agencies are doing that don't require the consent of the Congress. EPA and Department of Transportation, of course, announced last year new fuel economy and CO2 tailpipe standards for the first time. That is, combining fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions. And new standards, as reported in this morning's newspaper, so I can say it now, are coming for medium-duty and heavy-duty trucks. EPA's endangerment finding, of course. NOAA restructuring to consolidate all its activities related to what are now being called climate services, sort of analogous to the Weather Service, to provide the information that people need to effectively adapt to climate change. Department of Interior has been restructuring to develop climate change response centers, and so on. Partnership for Sustainable Communities going on among Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and EPA. Broad interagency efforts, there are a variety of these. Time is running on, so I'm not going to say too much about this, except that the President said to the very first cabinet meeting, the only kind of bad news I'm not prepared to hear from you people is that you're not cooperating. He said, you can tell me whatever other bad news I need to hear, but don't tell me you're not cooperating because the challenges are too big and our resources too meager to be able to afford non-cooperation. It was very clear in that instruction, and so we're doing a lot to build up interagency efforts on the energy and climate front. In terms of national climate change legislation, President Obama was emphatic that that legislation should include climate. That was not sufficient. We reluctantly and temporarily abandoned that hope because of insufficient support in the Senate, but we will be back. We are going to try in the next Congress. Again, the President has been making that clear. And in the meantime, EPA is moving ahead to control greenhouse gas emissions by regulation. Not the optimal approach, but if we can't get a price on carbon, we're going to do what we can with the powers we've got. The President intervened personally to salvage a tolerable outcome, not the outcome we had hoped for, but at least a tolerable outcome in Copenhagen last December. We have been elevating energy and climate cooperation in our international activities, ranging from the G8, the G20, the strategic and economic dialogues, been revitalizing ministerial level cooperation on science and technology with Brazil, China, India, Japan, Korea, and Russia. That was another instruction of the President to me very early in the administration to rebuild these science and technology cooperative activities, and climate and energy are front and center in those activities. New bilateral clean energy projects with China and India are emerging.